Next up is texture, which will make more sense in context with the erodible brush. So we'll be revisiting texture shortly. We have our beautiful new scatter brush. So what we're going to do is go back to our sampled brush for just a moment. And then we're going to come over to brush tips. And I'm just going to space this out a little bit more. So this one almost has a texture of its own by default. Let's get this at 100% normal mode. I just tapped 0 at the top of the keyboard to get 100% opacity. Got black, if I want to double check that, D on the keyboard for default. And you can see that there's almost a texture-like effect going on because of the way that this brush was designed. It has these little splatters and things happening in it. But what if we wanted more? What if we didn't feel that that was enough? Well, Photoshop's got us covered. Go for B for brush. Let me clear this out. It's still selected, so I can erase those easily. Pop over to texture. Now we have a handful of controls. By default, you'll have texture each tip, but we're going to turn that off for just a moment so that we can focus on this top bit. Now it says texture, but these are actually patterns, and these are some of the old school patterns in Photoshop. We'll be building our own patterns a little later in the semester, simply because they're fun. They grant us greater capability inside of Photoshop. There are a number of places that it uses patterns, and they can be useful for a lot of different things, especially after we cover blending modes, which this also uses. We'll be covering that later in the semester as well. So first off, let's grab some artistic surfaces. Artist surfaces. I can't quite see it from here. I've got a microphone keeping me further away from my display than I normally be. So you can replace or append. This is an old dialog that pops up. Append just means adding on to whatever little window you have. Replacing, if I press OK, will get rid of all of these and then fill in the one that I've selected. I'm going to append. Now we can see all of these little surfaces. If I click on one, sometimes if you mouse over these, it will talk a little bit about it, but not in this case. So I'm going to go ahead and click on one. You can also create a new preset from the current pattern. So what's it talking about there? Why is that? It has to do with scale, brightness, and contrast. So the scale is the scale of the pattern, which we cannot see particularly well in here. Let's pop over here and we'll texture this for a moment so that we can get an idea of what this looks like. So let me skip ahead and then we'll roll. So let's just set this for a moment from height to multiply. We'll talk about this in a minute. We're not going to texture each tip just yet. We're going to have 100% depth. So this is just so we can see what's going on with the texture. So just a moment, and then we'll explain what all that is. All right, so here's the texture. If we increase the scale, you can see in the preview that the scale of the pattern is increasing. It's like we've zoomed in on it. If we decrease the scale, you can see that it's now decreasing. And sure enough, it's so small that it's just a gray blob. So that might have been a little much. And if you increase, let me put this back to 100%. If you increase the brightness, guess what? Well, it should become either brighter or darker, depending on the direction that's going. Now, the reason that it's flipping around is because I have the mode set to multiply. I could set it to height, but that won't make much sense in this case because I'm using a mouse. We'll explain that in a moment. Subtract will have a much different effect. There we go. So more brightness, less brightness. Contrast, it simply removes the grays either by making them lighter or darker. So let me clear that out. And here we have a new texture. Now what happens if you add color? It simply colors the areas that are black or the gray ones with a slightly lighter color all the way up to white where it just becomes white. So that's texture. You also have the ability to invert your texture. So if you're flipping between modes and you accidentally got something you're not particularly happy or satisfied with, it's easy enough to press the invert to get them across. Now that said, we're going to cover what all these modes do in a future class. So for now, I hate to say this, later you'll know what these do. You'll look at them, you'll understand them, that will be it. And in fact, you know what a few of them do. Multiply makes things darker. Overlay makes the darks darker and the lights lighter. And then we should have some lightning ones, like lightning or burn, I suppose. But we'll talk. Oh, wait, burn. Wait, that makes things darker. I always get dodge and burn mixed up. We'll talk about all of these later. The one that would be missing would be height, and that has to do a little bit more with erodible brushes than anything else. If you were working with the brush pose, you can control the height of your brush. But again, we'll touch on that in a bit. So let's not worry about height just yet. We'll just set this to multiply so we can see it. For now, since you don't know what these do, just play with each one and see if you like it. Just by flipping it around, you'll see how it looks in the little preview stroke. Ooh, I like overlay because, again, grays are being changed, which means that it's just affecting the edges of this particular brush, which, if you remember, it has a light gray in it. Oh, that has a nice effect, doesn't it? All right, let me go ahead and clear that out. And zoom back out, Z on the keyboard, Alt. Okay, and B to get the brush. Excellent. Okay, and so we're back on texture. I'm going to set it to black and white real quick. Okay, so we've got a slight texture around the edge. A few other things going on here. We can texture each tip, and what this is going to do is right now it's texturing, if I have this off, it will texture the stroke. So in other words, the entire thing is textured as though it was one long brush tip. If you texture each tip, we can pop back over to the brush tip shape. We can increase the spacing a little bit so we could get a better idea. Come back to texture. We're going to switch it from overlay to multiply. So here it is with each tip. Here it is with the whole thing. Right now we don't see much of a difference. Back to brush shape. We squish these together. Now we know that they're touching. And without each tip textured, it looks like one continuous piece. However, with each tip textured, now it's a little hard to see. With each tip textured, it will have, wow, it's really hard to see. Oh, it's because of the grays that have been created on this. It has an overlap of lightness. So let's build another brush real quick just so that we can see this. In fact, let's just grab a hard round brush. That should be sufficient. There we go. Hard round brush, excellent. Tip shape, we'll just have kind of a little bit of an overlap. We'll go to texture, and we will set it not to height, but to multiply. Let's texture it itself. Oh, multiply is not going to be great for that. And it actually, you can barely tell. So let's go ahead and really accentuate that. I'm going to change the depth that's occurring. Now you'll be able to see it. Here it is with the single stroke being textured. Here it is with each individual being textured. That's the difference. Essentially, each little stamp that's occurring gets textured when you have the texture each tip selected. You can play with these and get different colors and enjoy them. I'm going to set this just to subtract because we'll be able to see the texture very easily, regardless of if it's each tip or if it's as an entire stroke that's occurring. So what does this magical depth do? Well, all it's doing is saying how much texture should be applied. At 0%, and I say that now, it will make more sense a little later. Well, let me just draw a little diagram. So let's say that you had a piece of chalk and you had a kind of grainy texture going on. Now, if you took that piece of chalk and you pressed it right against the tooth, not very much of the chalk would break off and get into the textured paper. If you pressed it deeper in, you'd be filling in even more of this space that's occurring in it. So the depth is just how far down are you pressing into this so that you can get more and more texture. So at 0% depth, you're not actually getting any texture on it whatsoever. At 100% depth, you're getting total texture. And this is kind of reverse. The reason is that it's talking about how much depth in regards to the texture pattern moving, not to the chalk. So it's inverted to this. So sorry about that. But essentially, at 0% depth would be what we would consider 100%, where it's filling in entirely. At 100% depth, it would just have the entire texture because it's only touching the top bumps, so you can see all the way through. Yeah, so it's kind of flipped from how you'd expect. A lot of things in Photoshop are kind of flipped from how you expect because they're taking the approach not necessarily from the brush, but from whatever you're on at the time you're working with it. So it's talking about how far in the texture depth is occurring is kind of reversed on that. Anyway, hope that makes sense. Essentially, higher depth, the more texture will be applied. The lower the depth, the less texture will be applied to it. Now, if we texture each tip, we have a couple of additional options available to us. And especially if we do, like, for example, oh, that's odd. I remember a minimum, oh, that's right. As with the controls, there is a minimum depth. Let's say that we just keep it on multiply for now. Oh, I don't have a layer on. That's awkward. Multiply for now. So we're producing some texture at a good 53% depth. But if we were to add in some depth jitter, sometimes we get a lot of texture, and sometimes we wouldn't get much texture at all. Now keep in mind, if you have a single stroke, it will calculate all of that in one go. So it's almost as though you're creating a mask on top of an opaque layer so that you can see below it to a textured layer. That's how I think of it. You don't have to think of it that way if you don't want to. That's just something I do. But with the tips, since it's each individual tip, it will start to have different amounts of texture applied as it goes up and down. You're looking at this, you're like, well, why is that any good? That's useless, right? Well, no, if we go to our digital cloud brush that we created earlier, this could be a good place to use exactly that texture using, we'll do subtract, and we'll do a depth jitter on it. Now look at that. I think that's a lot more interesting. Now it's automatically being blended because on this particular brush, we used grays at the time that we created it on the outside, which allows it to blend together better. And in fact, it allows it to blend together better even when we have a wider space going on. So let me zoom out a little bit, clear that out, grab my brush. Oh, look at that. Isn't that fun? I'd probably lower the space a little bit more, but I'm starting to get an idea of what's going on there. Now then, if we were to go back to texture, if we set our control to something like fade, which we know will drop down and then disappear, now we'll have a minimum depth. At 0%, there will be a lot of texture because, again, it feels inverted. But if we flip invert, it still doesn't do it because it's reverse of how we'd expect. Even if you're in multiply mode, just to prove that it has nothing to do with the fact that it's being subtracted. Let me knock it down to 5 tips. So there you have it. But what if you want to have a minimum amount of depth always occurring so that you always have some texture? So it's like you start off pressing very hard and then it just gets a softer press as that chalk goes into maybe cement if you're doing some chalk on cement type thing. But better than fade, pen pressure. Now, if you don't have a pen, fade's going to be your friend if you want to have a little bit of something going on in there. But I've got my pen here. Let's make a stroke. And you can see that it is a little oversensitive. So we're going to decrease the jitter a little bit, and we're going to increase the minimum depth. There we go. Okay, so now start with a soft press, then a hard press, and then very soft again. And you can see that we get more or less texture. Now, this feels natural. As you press harder, you're sort of crushing into the cement with your chalk, so it's filling all the little crevices and you get a nice thick line. As you pull away, you're just touching the tip of the cement, and so you just get a little bit of color on it, and so you get a lot of texture in it because you got a lot of that spacing. Okay, hopefully that makes sense to you. If you want further explanation into that, go ahead and let me know. But we're going to come back to this when we start modeling erotables, and erotables include things like chalk, charcoal, crayon, Conte crayon, stuff that dissolves. So we will be coming back to this in a bit. And the mode will make more sense later once we've talked in depth about what all of these blending modes do and how they all work. So I'd recommend revisiting this after you've learned about how to handle all the blending modes. All right, let's move on to the next set of brush controls.